had in mind to invite Dave Dempsey. I've known about Dave for a long time. I first encountered or knew about Dave with his book, Great Lakes for Sale. George Dilla, some of you know George Dilla, had a radio program, and he was going to interview Dave on the program, and George Dilla asked me if I would also be on the program. And so I read the book, and Dave was on, and we talked about that, and I never met Dave, so I'm very excited that he's here today. He has helped shape conservation in the Great Lakes for 40 years, over 40 years. That's amazing. He's author and co-author of 9 conservation books about the Great Lakes. I just recently read the one that you did with your brother on the writing for Michigan. Yeah, that was very interesting. He's currently a policy advisor for Flow, that is for the love of water. Up in Traverse City, they've worked a lot on the Line 5 project and other water programs. It's a nonprofit environmental organization. Dave served as an environmental advisor to Michigan Governor James Blanchard for 6 years. That's pretty impressive. He served in leadership and policy positions with Michigan Council of Environmental Quality, Michigan Office, Clean Water Action, Great Lakes Fishery Commission, Conservation Minnesota, and International Joint Commission. Wow. He has a Bachelor's of Art from Western, and a Master's of Science from Michigan State. He lives in Traverse City, Michigan, and I'm so excited to have him here. And when we were talking about this during our Earthday planning, Sharon Edgar says, well, I know Dave very well. I used to work with him. And so she has stayed in touch with Dave, and they talked about what kind of program they would do. And we also were going to have Lois DeBacher. And she had a family emergency, so she wasn't able to make it. So I'm hoping that everything's okay. But please welcome Dave Dempsey and Sharon Edgar, one of our great board members. And depending on how long this conversation goes, we can also have questions from the audience. Thank you.
Well, welcome everybody. So this is working, right? Anyway, so I've got some questions that Dave thinks he's seen ahead of time for him to talk to. But before we get started, I'd like Dave to just welcome us and tell him a little bit about himself and talk about Earthday for a little bit.
Thanks, Sharon. Well, thanks for inviting me here today. I'm really impressed by AFFEW, and I've been aware of the work they've been doing for 30 years now, over 30 years. Groups like AFFEW really are the backbone of the environmental movement in Michigan and the environmental progress in Michigan. Some of us get paid to do the work, and we try to do the best we can, but we can't do anything without volunteers and public sentiment behind environmental protection. So I appreciate what Julie and the board have done over the years. Thinking about Earthday, somebody was saying the other day that we really ought to call it Water Day because 70% of the Earth is water. And just this morning I was looking at pictures of Michigan from the space station looking down, and it's amazing. We sometimes forget how much water surrounds Michigan. There is, of course, you've probably heard, there's 20% of the world's surface fresh water in the Great Lakes. Now, of the water on the Earth, only 3% is actually drinkable, the rest is salt water. And of the 3%, 1/5 of that is the Great Lakes. So we've got a huge percentage here that needs to be protected. Michigan has done a lot over the years, protect and safeguard the water. We had times back in the 100 years ago when people literally were drinking their own sewage because we didn't have modern wastewater facilities, and people were dying because of exposure, typhoid and cholera. So we cleaned that up. Then along came the chemical problems in the 60s and 70s, DDT, mercury, and others, and we took action against those. Now the threats are much more diffuse. One of the ones that concerns me is plastics, microplastics. We were finding through the science that we all have plastic particles in our bodies, in our organs, in our blood, and no one really knows what that effect will be in the long term. So we've got new challenges that need to be addressed. And I'm confident with the kind of energy that you show that we can actually face those threats successfully. So I'm looking forward to this conversation, and also hopefully we'll have time, you can ask questions about any environmental issue you want to. Go.
So Julia gave us your bio, and I know you'd be a humble individual, but unfortunately I'm going to put you on the spot. So tell us, pick one or two things about your 40-year career.
Well, I began when I was 4, so.
Oh, okay. Right, well, so then you can talk about things you did as a child.
Right.
But give us one or two things you're really proud of to have been involved in.
Well, any environmental accomplishment is not an individual achievement, it's a team effort. And there's one issue that I'm really excited to be part of the team. That was Michigan wilderness protection. The Sierra Club was the lead group on that and fought for it during the 80s. And it was not an easy fight to win. There are plenty of people who think wilderness is anathema because it locks up land. It can't be used productively. But the Sierra Club, via Ann Wywoody, who was the organizer and the chair, a bunch of us worked with her, and Congress passed the Wilderness Bill in 1987, which includes Nordhaus Dunes, which is the only wilderness on national forest land in the Lower Peninsula. So getting that done was a major feeling of good work and solidarity and teamwork. That's one that I remember very proudly. And the other, I think, big issues have to do with the Great Lakes. In 2008, Michigan and the other Great Lakes states joined the Great Lakes Compact, which is a regional agreement to protect the Great Lakes from diversion. There are some problems with that I've written about, but still it's a step forward in trying to protect our water from being shipped or exported out to the Southwest, which you may have heard has a few water issues lately. So that was a big issue. And actually, solid waste, recycling. Sharon was a major factor in state solid waste policy and projects, and we haven't come nearly as far as we want to in that, but we made some initial steps back in the 80s to begin the process of diverting garbage to useful ends through recycling.
One of the things when I was thinking about this session and talking with you was going back to the days where we both worked. You were Governor Blanchard's environmental advisor, and I had worked for the Office of Great Lakes, which Governor Blanchard established. And then also a lot of the solid waste policies and recycling policies that we are still struggling with today started under the Blanchard administration in terms of there becoming mandates for recycling. So it made me think about how I ended up in an environmental career. I retired from the Michigan Department of Transportation, so I kind of shifted gears about 15 years into my career. But what drove this for you as a career back? I think back to the 70s where we were learning about environmental issues in high school, and that sort of caught my interest, and I decided that's what I wanted to do for a career. What about you?
Well, I thought environmental issues were important in my youth, but I really didn't commit to environmental protection as a career until I went backpacking with some friends on Picture Rocks National Lakeshore. And it was the first time I camped in my life. I recall waking up, I was the first one to wake up because I was so uncomfortable in my tent. And I could hear the waves pounding against the bluffs of Picture Rocks, and I just had this kind of almost religious conversion. I thought, this is something I want to protect for that people 500 years from now can actually enjoy it. So that was sort of the turning point to making this a vocation, not just an avocation.
All right, we're going to come back to a little history, but let's talk about some of the issues. So I have a list of issues here, and for each one you can talk about your history or experience with the issue, or what you think the current challenges are now, or both. So let's start off with the big one, which is Great Lakes water quality.
Yes, Great Lakes water quality. Well, the water is visibly cleaner than it was 53 years ago on the first Earth Day. Back then we had a significant algae issue, which I'll talk about in a minute. It's sort of come back, I feel like, Gary. But we took action to reduce phosphorus in laundry detergents, and later in dishwashing. So that's a major source of nutrients that contribute to algae bloom. So that's a good news story for the most part. But as I mentioned, microplastics are a problem. We still have large areas of the Great Lakes that have contaminants. I think if you look at all the Great Lakes, there is not one square mile of the Great Lakes that is not a fish advisory for some contaminant, because these persistent chemicals stick around for generations, if not centuries. So we still have mercury, PCB, and DDT advisories for some of the fish. That's unfortunate. Even if we were to completely stop discharging those chemicals today, it would be a long time before they completely disappear. Probably the biggest issue that we face with respect to water quality is agriculture, especially industrial farming with livestock. We have some areas of the state, I think there's a large CAFO, we call them, not so far from here, down the shore a little bit. But anyway, some of these CAFOs churn out enough manure to equal cities of 50,000 people, so they're large sources, and we need to do something about that. And of course, we have stormwater runoff in cities, so we still have to do more to retain water that runs into our streets and have it discharge more slowly through such means as rain gardens. So there's a lot to be done still.
When I first joined the Michigan Department of Natural Resources, my job was with the Office of Great Lakes. It was 1997 maybe, I'd have to go back, and the Great Lakes were at one of their all-time highs. And one of my jobs was to oversee a program under the Blanchard administration of low interest or no interest loans to homeowners to move their houses away from the bluff because of the water levels and because of the erosion. And then moved here in Ludington, and of course we were dealing with those issues just more recently in terms of water levels. And it's something we, even if you aren't lucky enough to have a house on the lake, which I don't, with the pier, you become really cognizant of the water levels and the issues with water levels. So talk a little bit about Great Lakes water levels, and then we're going to talk about the diversion issue. But let's talk about water levels first.
Well, I have to make a confession. One of my books I wrote about the Great Lakes in 30 years, which has been 20 years ago, I guess. And my scenario was that we would have water levels would go so low because of climate change that freighters couldn't float. Well, we actually are heading in the reverse direction. In two ways. One is we have more of a whipsaw between high and low water levels instead of the natural cycle of 7 to 10 years. It's more like 2 or 3 years, and that's because of the changes in roadway precipitation falls. So we're going to enter a period of really unpredictable water levels. But I'd say overall we're going to have more water and less because of the change in the jet stream and the way in which storms generate precipitation. But we'll have to get used to the rapid rise and fall. It's going to be difficult on some of the property owners to handle that. But there's a lot of communities now that are planning for what's called coastal resiliency, which is to try to adapt to these changing water levels. So we're going to see the continuation of the, as I said, the whipsaw of lower water levels.
What's the current movement within state government about talking about resiliency? One of the things, again, I mentioned that I retired from the Michigan Department of Transportation, and resiliency in the transportation system is a really key issue, because with erosion and with water levels, you can actually lose roads and bridges. So it's an important thing within transportation, and they're really focusing on it. But I know it was hard in some of the work groups I was getting. It was hard to get state officials to think that far out. They're so focused on today's emergency. The idea of focusing on something that could happen 20 years from now is just really difficult. Do you think, is there movement within the state government here to deal with resiliency issues, or is it mostly a local issue?
There is movement. There is a grant program that's been established to assist communities in the planning process. But as you imply, anything that's long-term tends to fade away after a while. Politicians are not elected in the long term, they're elected in the short term. So, I think beyond 4 years for a governor or 2 years for a representative is a little dicey. So this is a case where we need citizens to step up and assure that the political leaders continue a commitment to not just coastal resiliency, but also to these clean energy policies that we're hearing a lot about in the state. A lot of states like Michigan are setting renewable energy goals for the year 2050. Well, that's fine because most of the people that are in office now won't have to carry them out. They're going to be long gone by then. So it's easy to set a long-term goal. We need to have interim goals too. So hopefully that'll happen.
I'm relatively new to Ludington. Are there folks, do you know if this is an issue at the local level within city government, talking about resiliency, either coastal resiliency or just resiliency as it relates to climate change? Has it ever come up here as a local issue?
A few years back,
Stand, face the group, or you can, here you go, there you go.
Steve would probably remember this when Ludington went through the Resilient Ludington program. Remember that?
Vaguely.
Vaguely, okay. And they hired a company, Jim, maybe you did, Clark, remember? They hired a company, I think it was out of Traverse, and to work on resiliency for climate change, which was pretty interesting. And they had lots of town hall meetings, and they were talking about what they could do to work with climate change and in the community, like even making areas for elder people to go if their air conditioning went on, things like that, just so that they wouldn't die of heat stroke or anything like that. And they were working on planting more trees and things like that. And Kathy Winchester was a former board member who's on the city council, and Wally right there is on the city council, and I know they put resiliency in the plan, and there was some controversy about that word. Yeah. So it's been interesting, but yeah,
What about alternative energy? Is the city into that issue at all?
yeah.
A little bit?
The city has refurbished the wastewater treatment plant, and they've drained a few ponds over there, and we are looking to put solar panels in that empty space and continue to use it for bird migration, but also fill the ponds up with solar panels. So yes.
Great. That's great.
And it's interesting you mentioned about, I was reading an article about climate change and how a lot of senior centers and community centers in the western part of the state were built without air conditioning. So they really aren't effective places for seniors or people who need shelter in a high temperature area. So that was something that they were having to deal with, is that they should never build facilities like that anymore that can't serve as a place for people to shelter when temps go up so high. So talk about diversion. I remember it's been a big issue for a long time about the idea that they've got so many water problems out west and the Great Lakes look so good to them. One of the things that saves us a little bit is we are in international water. So, you can't get just the governors to agree to sell out the lakes. You have to get Canada on that side as well, and that helps a little bit. Talk a little bit more about the idea of using Great Lakes water elsewhere in the country.
There are a lot of schemes to use the Great Lakes for other regions. Going back 50 years, there was a Canadian who proposed a massive project starting in James Bay, turning that water around and sending it south, and sending the Great Lakes south and west to help water needs there. That's many billion dollar proposal didn't go anywhere. But since the early 80s, there have been more serious proposals. The Army Corps of Engineers studied the idea back then, and we actually had a drought in 1988, falling back up. Chicago's been diverting Great Lakes water since 1900. And they did that initially because they were wanting to send the sewage of Chicago away from their Lake Michigan drinking water intake. Because until that time, they were actually flushing their sewage into their drinking water. So they reversed the flow of the Chicago River, and they sent it down to the Mississippi River. Not surprisingly, St. Louis was not really pleased with that, but they had to put up with it. We still have that going on. There's 3,200 cubic feet per second of Great Lake Michigan water that's flowing out of the basin. And in 1988, we had this huge drought, and it was early summer, and water levels of the Great Lakes were going way down. So were the water levels of the Mississippi River. The barges were unable to flow on the Mississippi. So the governor of Illinois wanted to triple the Chicago diversion, which can be done without any change in the structures there. That has the capacity, current capacity, to triple that. So that would be the easiest diversion to implement. It could be done tomorrow if there was agreement. Of course, the Great Lakes governors would not agree to that. But then again, in 1998, there was a company called the Nova Group, which was based in Ontario. We got a permit to take 50 freighters worth of Lake Superior water a year and ship it to Asia. And people of the Great Lakes region were just astounded by that and protested it. And the company actually backed down. But that led to the negotiation of the Great Lakes Compact that I mentioned earlier, which took about 10 years to negotiate. It was sold as a ban on diversion. It bans most diversion, although not the Chicago diversion, that's still grandfathered. But it also allows for water to be bottled and sold anywhere in the country. So we have that loophole that could theoretically allow ownership of Great Lakes water on a large scale. Right now, Nestle is the only company that's, not Nestle has sold their holdings to a company called Blue Triton, but they're taking water from Michigan and selling it around the region. So there's that loophole, commercial sale of water. And there's concern about the ability of the compact to hold on population growth and therefore congressional representation and power in the United States is shifting to the Southwest. So there may be changes in the political dynamic that would allow the compact to be weakened or even repealed. So that's something we have to watch out for.
So you mentioned your, as one of the things you were proud of was wilderness protection. One of my many jobs with the state was I ran a grant program that served communities for them to buy land for public recreation or put facilities in for public recreation. It's called the Michigan Natural Resources Trust Fund. And one of the constant debates was buying land for things like bike trails, and I'm a cyclist and that's great, versus buying land for habitat protection. One of them feeling more like it was, aimed at people's daily lives compared to long-term protection. So talk about public land protection in Michigan, and do you think we're doing a good enough job with public land protection and public land access in this state?
Well, one of the great things about Michigan that you sort of alluded to is we have this fund. We were one of the first, if not the first state in the country to do this in the 70s. We take revenues from oil and gas drilling on state land and put it into a fund to buy public land, both local and state land. And there's been a tension from the beginning about whether that money should be spent primarily on undeveloped or pristine land, so to speak, or to spend it on lands that people can recreate on. One of the colorful figures of the Michigan conservation movement was Tom Washington, who was at MUCC. He was quite a character. One thing that he stood for that I think we could praise him for was he wanted to have more state land bought, recreational land bought around where people live, especially cities, so that people would not have to drive 100 miles or 200 miles to enjoy parks. So that's been part of the focus. I think over the years we've done a better job of balancing the need for active recreation lands and pristine lands. I think that to have an environmental movement or a conservation constituency in the state, you have to have people that are recreating outdoors and enjoying it. In fact, the first step toward an environmental consciousness really is to enjoy the environment. You can't really be motivated to protect what you don't love. You're going to love it if you get outside and enjoy our resources. So I think we've made a gradual shift toward more emphasis on that. The best thing about the trust fund, though, is that it's a permanent fund. It's an endowment. And back in the 80s, it was put into the Michigan Constitution by the voters, which was interesting because most of the editorial writers in Michigan were against that. They said it's inappropriate to put a fund in the Constitution. It's cluttering up a clean document. But the voters, and they've had to re-vote on this several times. The voters have approved it by 65–70% each time. So it's a gift. I know there have been efforts to buy land to add to the Ludington State Park, for example. And I think one of those efforts was successful. So that's an example of land that people are going to recreate on locally.
To two things came to mind while you were talking. Let me start with the one because I've forgotten the first one, so I'll come back to that. But the issue of environmental justice and social justice, and I do remember when I was responsible for the trust fund, the idea of buying land that maybe not as significant in terms of its habitat or its wilderness, but it was accessible to where the population was, especially lower income populations and inner city populations, and you need that access to create a concept of connection to the environment versus buying land that may again protect critical habitat. So that's a constant battle in terms of environmental issues that are focused on people's daily lives and needs. So talk a little bit about, in terms of public land or any other issue, the connection between environmental protection and environmental justice and social justice.
One of the great things that has happened in recent years is the Detroit area focus on public lands. We didn't even have a state park in Detroit or close to Detroit until recently. That park is now the Milligan State Park, which is right on the waterfront of Detroit. And it's turned out to be a great magnet for people from Detroit and other areas close to Detroit to get outside. It's a major sport fishery and a way of getting kids in the inner city to experience nature. And I've heard stories over the years of Chicago and Detroit of kids that grew up within 5 or 10 miles of Lake Michigan or the Detroit River, have never been to see it. I mean, they are that cut off from the waters around them. So the efforts that have been made to bring state parks, state lands, and state fisheries and wildlife programs to the city have been very laudable. As far as environmental justice, that's a term that really relates to the overexposure of urban populations to multiple sources of pollution. There are subsistence fisheries in Detroit that rely on sport fish as a major source of protein. And if you eat a lot of sport fish, you are at greater risk of being exposed to unsafe levels of contamination. Those are the same people that are going to be breathing in unsafe air more than others, and also being exposed to other environmental insults like lead poisoning and older housing and so forth. So the effort in environmental justice really is to try to deal with those threats. We should mention also that urban populations are often more exposed to hazardous waste sites and contamination sites, so that's another factor. And the movement is, I think, shifting to more of an urban concern, that people our focus ought to be just as much on people in urban areas as it is in trees up north. So that's happening, which is good.
When I worked for the Department of Transportation, it was just as, I'm not an engineer and I'm not a transportation professional. It was interesting to be around transportation professionals, but I was there when they were just beginning to see the impact that the transportation system has had on communities and urban communities, and the number of communities that have been destroyed by expanding freeways or access to urban freeways, usually bypasses, when you bypass the main freeway. So it was interesting to watch that profession sort of gain a new understanding of the impact that their history has had on urban populations. They weren't enjoying it, but they were getting there. So I remember my second part. One of the things that I learned when I was with the Natural Resources Trust Fund, which I hadn't really realized, is how important hunting is to land protection. How many of the lands that are available for public recreation were actually bought with hunting licenses. And we enjoy them as hikers. And I don't hunt, but the hunting is decreasing as an activity, and therefore hunting licenses is decreasing as an opportunity to buy public lands for public recreation. I remember when I was in the DNR, they were like, we need to get people to hunt. And I thought, well, either that or we need to find what they are doing and tax that. One of the things that I didn't like in government is the fact that we don't do general taxes much anymore. We tax an activity. Declining in Michigan, and are we running out of money for buying public lands?
Yeah, it is decreasing substantially. It's the number of licenses basically is going down every year. It's just most people are not being exposed to it when they're in use, so there are other pursuits that have overtaken it, and particularly biking, mountain biking, as well as other biking. So we ought to tax biking, right? More fees on bikers.
I'm all about general fund, just more
Right.
taxes. Just more taxes.
Well, I can remember when we basically had, our park system was paid for by general funds, and you could get into a state park for $1, and now it's, I don't know what it is, you get the recreation passport, but it's a lot more expensive. So yeah, we need to do more general taxation, but over the years, they've shifted all the park general fund to something else, and so our park system is reliant largely on fees. I was going to mention, talking about roads, there's a project in the Traverse City area that just won't die. It's called the Hartman-Hammond Connector. It's to try to create a road that goes around Traverse City. It connects the US 31 on the south with US 31 on the east. And the locals there thought they had killed it 20 years ago, but now it's come back. It would include a bridge that spans the Ormond River high up. It would be the second longest bridge in Michigan after the Mackinac Bridge. It's just an amazing boondoggle, I think. But
Because the Zilwaukee Bridge was such a necessary thing.
right, yeah. So roads have a habit of not going away. People are still addicted to roads, and we need to deal with that. But on the other hand, also 20 years ago when I worked at the Michigan Environmental Council, we were trying to get a train to operate between Ann Arbor, or Detroit actually, and Traverse City. And we're still studying that 20 years later. I don't know if it'll ever happen, probably not in my lifetime,
No.
even though I plan to live another 50 years. So.
Okay, well then, we'll put that on your to-do list.
Okay.
Yeah. The other thing, for those folks, I mean, if you're familiar with Grand Haven, again, I don't want to talk bad about MDOT because it was actually 15 best years of my career, but transportation is trained, the professionals are trained for fast and safe. That's basically what they were taught in school. And they so want to make it easier to get on through US 31 through Grand Haven. Whereas if you live in Grand Haven, you see that as your main street. And so they're like, no, quit messing with it. We don't care for the people that it takes more time to get through our city. But it's a toughie because you're dealing with that. It's one of the things that, again, I appreciated in transportation. They did a whole book on highways as main streets and beginning to realize that it's not just about fast and safe. It's about other things that roads do well and don't do well in terms of pedestrians and bicyclists. So let's see where I stand on this. Let's turn this over.
Let's throw it open for questions too. You got a lot of questions left though.
Yeah, well, no, not much. So you talked about the, and I'm really hard with the word proliferation, I have to slow down to say that, about toxic chemicals such as PFAS. So talk about that a little bit, and then we'll see what the audience wants to talk about before I go back to my questions.
PFAS are an excellent example of one of the complications of environmental issues right now. They're a family of chemicals that are used for water repellent clothing, boots, for nonstick pans, and the reason that they've been so successful in the marketplace is because they not only provide functions that we didn't have before, but they also last a long time. They also last a long time in the environment once they're disposed of or volatilized or run off into the environment. So we have Michigan at least 250 sites of PFAS contamination that is causing great concern about health impacts. I think the gist of the issue is it's our own habits, our own lifestyles that are creating the problem. It's not somebody else at a factory that's spewing these things into the environmental that does happen. But well, the larger problem is that we buy these things and use these things, and we create the problem. And there's a lot of pollution issues these days, including the plastics issue that I mentioned, where we are the source, and we need to deal with that. But it's going to be incredibly hard. State government, under Governor Whitmer, has set drinking water standards for PFAS to keep people's exposure down, but that's the back end of the problem. We need to deal with the front end, both ends really. The front end means we have to phase out some of these products. One of the uses that PFAS have been put to use for is firefighting foams. So there's been a safety issue, a safety concern to get rid of the PFAS foams, is that going to result in more damage and more death? So there are alternatives that are more expensive that are being introduced, but it's going to take a while to fully transition to those. So it's not easy to get rid of forms of pollution when we're the source of them.
We had the year that our Earth Day celebration for AFFEW went remote because of the pandemic. Our guest speaker, wasn't talking about microplastics and was talking about how much of that comes from our wardrobes. And as somebody who is an active cyclist and hiker, practically all of my wardrobe is not cotton or wool, but more the synthetic fabrics, and that has an impact in terms of plastic threads when you're washing and drying. I have yet to switch over to cotton and wool because Smart Wool refuses to reduce their prices, but it is something that I realize I'm contributing to in terms of, as a consumer, that my demand for products are contributing to that. So Julia has a mic, and I still have some more questions, but before I have more questions, what would others like to hear Dave speak to?
Or you?
I just want to make a comment.
Dave.
We took our grandson out on the Inland Seas scooter, and they go and dig into the soil or the sediment and stuff like that, and then put it underneath the microscope. And 50 feet down, there were microfibers in there. Yeah, up in Grand Traverse Bay.
Earlier you said that cities and communities should plan for 50 years going out. Can you elaborate what specifically do these cities, or should they be planning for? And can you give advice into how to actually promote those goals?
Well, primarily, we should be planning for infrastructure. There are communities that have sewage systems that are at risk from higher water levels and damage. There's housing that's located probably too close to the lakeshore and rivers that feed them for flooding threats. There are roads, as I mentioned, other public infrastructure that needs to be. We need to take that into account, the higher fluctuating water levels. We tend to build on the assumption that past water level trends are going to continue, and that we're going to see much dramatic change over the coming years. So I think it's basically a public infrastructure issue that we need to site things away from where they can be damaged. And marinas, for example, are also at risk from higher water levels. So it's a sort of a road, highway, and sewage and drinking water system issue.
One of the things I remember when I worked for the trust fund, again, it funds acquisition of land, but also the development of recreational facilities. And the number of communities that had playgrounds that flooded, and I suspect that's happening more and more. And it's because that land was low land anyway, never got developed, usually ended up in the city's hands, so it became a playground. But now, if you've got areas that are flooding more often, you're talking about facilities that are no longer accessible for their purpose. So looking at flooding is an issue as well.
You mentioned earlier that algae was an issue back in its day. It's really not gone away, and it's in some ways increasing both in complexity in both Great Lakes and inland waters, including toxic algae. What needs to be done?
Well, a good example is Western Lake Erie. Lake Erie was considered a worldwide success story back in the 90s because between the time that Lake Erie was declared dead in the 60s to the 90s, water quality dramatically improved. I can remember, it's going to date me, but 1966, my family lived in the Detroit area, so we went to Point Pelee National Park in Ontario to swim, and we thought it was seaweed all the way to the horizon. We didn't want to stick our toes in it that day. Then by 1975, I went back and it seemed almost pure water. We were able to swim in it without any concern at all. And that was largely due to, as I mentioned, the detergent phosphorus limitations. But back in the late 90s and continuing into the present day, Lake Erie, Western Lake Erie has had tremendous algae problem. Again, and it's this time because of runoff from largely these factory farms, animal waste and fertilizers that run off into the water and feed the algae blooms. And warming waters too contribute to that. So, and as you mentioned, there are some inland waters in Michigan and elsewhere that are at risk. The Saginaw Bay is also at risk. So we need to, another complicated issue, we need to change our way of growing food, and we need to change our way of economics so that farmers make more money and can invest in and spend more money on control of these inputs. And it's very difficult to get that done, but we need to do that. We're just going to see worsening problems. Back in 2014, there was a weekend when people of the city of Toledo could not drink their water because of toxic algae blooms. We're going to see more of that too if we don't shape up.
And it feels like I know more and more people who are going vegetarian or vegan, not for personal health, but for the health of the planet. Yeah, Julia. Not me yet.
I have two questions, or maybe it's one two-part question. Related to the local infrastructure, my passion has always been groundwater. There's a big hole in the ground in the city of Ludington that used to be a building called Michael's. The rumor is, and maybe someone can correct me, is that the reason there's a delay is there's a river very close to the level of which the hole is right now. And I would assume that means there's environmental and infrastructure problems around that. What happens in a case like that? And I guess my part B of the same question is, on a state level, what is happening with groundwater protection issues right now?
I'm so glad you asked, because groundwater is one of my passions. I think I'm the only person in Michigan that thinks groundwater should be a passion. 45% of the state's population gets its drinking water from groundwater. And almost everybody in rural areas gets their water from a well, which is, of course, groundwater. And we have big problems because it's a resource you cannot see. If you can't see it, you don't know what the problem is. And in the rural areas, nitrate contamination is a major problem. We have thousands of wells that are contaminated by that. It's not something that you can see or taste very much, so it's maybe in many people's wells that they don't know about it. So at Flow, I've been working on groundwater for the last 4 or 5 years. We've been trying to get state policy to deal more with protecting and preventing groundwater contamination. Water is kind of implied. Groundwater ends up almost always in surface water. We wouldn't have the El Sabo River and the great fishing that we have there without steady flow of cold, clear, clean water flowing from the ground into the river. But it also means that contaminated groundwater is flowing into our rivers and lakes. And there are 2,000 locations around Michigan where that's happening. I don't know about the specifics that you're talking about, but I would be glad to look into that.
Yesterday I went up to hear this really good speaker up in Manistee, and it was at an environmental conference there. And one of the other participants gave out this figure of approximately 15 million people will be moving to Michigan in the next 25 or so years because of the problems elsewhere in the country with the environment, like the Southwest Florida. That was shocked me. I thought, I've heard that we're going to be a climate haven, but I've never heard an actual figure. So with all the questions about infrastructure and that, and like Wally was talking about 50 years, that's going to put a huge impact on us. So have you heard of anything like that, a projection or anything?
I haven't heard that number, 15 million. Was that what you said, 15 million? 1.5? I've heard of several million, 3 to 5 million in the next 30, 40 years. Whatever the amount is, it's going to be a major impact on Michigan. Yeah, climate refugees is what it's called. People that come from other parts of the country that are drying up and heating up to Michigan, because we're going to be relatively buffered by the Great Lakes. We'll have obviously lots of water, and the lakes will moderate the temperature extremes to some extent. So climate resiliency may also mean planning for a huge population increase. What is that going to mean too? Are we going to be selling off our public lands for places for people to live? And all these questions have to be dealt with. They're not being thought about much. A lot of the policymakers will welcome more bodies coming here because they'll think it's tax-based and jobs and so forth. So it's not going to be a simple issue to resolve. We better start thinking about it right now, I think, as public policy, not just academic matter.
And Michigan's never been very good in terms of land use planning at the statewide level. Michigan's a home rule state, and everything that you have to deal with those kind of infrastructure issues tends to fall on local government, rather than there being much in the way of state leadership.
I'm interested in knowing more about people with informed opinions about electric vehicle and especially battery manufacturing and the impact on the environment. Just this week, we learned that over in Mecosta County in Big Rapids, the State Senate Committee authorized a $175 million grant to build help a company build a plant in Mecosta County there. And there's some opposition to that politically because the parent company of that outfit is from China. There's some people who feel maybe that bring communism to Mecosta County. I don't really worry about that. I worry more about the manufacturing of batteries. And is that a good thing? I'm not totally on board with EVs yet. I'm thinking I probably should be. I'm just wondering, is it worth the cost of battery building? I guess is my question.
Well, it's definitely a trade-off. I mean, it's not a cliche thing. It's not a panacea. It's not, we're going to shift to EVs and we suddenly have a solve our problems. Not only are there problems with the actual use of batteries, but the mining of materials for batteries, the disposal of batteries are also a major concern. So I would, and they're also very expensive vehicles right now. I'm not able to afford one, so we'll have to bring down the price significantly to make a difference. And there's also the problem that we are investing in EVs and not investing in public transit, which should also be a climate change answer. And even rail would be an answer to some extent. So we need to diversify our alternatives to current fossil fuel-based automobiles and other forms of transportation. I'd like to see more of a discussion about the trade-offs. I frankly have not heard much of that. And my knowledge of that issue is unfortunately pretty limited, so I'd like to see much more dialogue about that.
Sarah Boland, one of our board members, her good friend that grew up here, was in charge of making the batteries and overseeing the recycling of the batteries. We're going to get her up here one of these days and talk about that. She's now retired, but she would be there.
A lot of our electronic waste, and I think that includes EV materials, goes to third world countries where it causes health problems there. It's recycled and sent overseas.
Although right now, Huntington Bay is collecting small electronics for recycling, and they go to a company where they separate it, use what they can. I think Camperdo is a good one that does all the recycling here and has special needs people that will help.
One of the things we need to do is create a take-back system where companies that manufacture materials that end up as hazardous waste will take back those products and recycle them. Minnesota, when I lived there, had a take-back law for some products, televisions and other electronics. Manufacturers or the retailers actually took them back and then shipped them back to the manufacturers for recycling. So it's called producer responsibility. That's I think a trend of the future. It's not going to be welcomed with open arms by the industry, but it's probably the future.
Anyone else?
So we are getting near the end, and what I'd like, is there a topic regarding environmental protection or natural resources protection that we haven't talked about that you think we should be talking about yet today?
Only a few thousand. There's so many.
Pick one.
I want to talk about recycling.
Okay.
One of the great things Michigan did, thanks to the voters in 1976, was to create the bottle deposit law. It was sold as a way of controlling litter and promoting more recycling of the materials that these containers are made out of. A lot of people have asked since then, well, why don't we expand it to include water bottles and other containers? We have right now basically soda pop and beer are the containers that are recycled. And the reason is, politically, it would be very difficult the industries that are currently covered do not like the law, and they've been trying to get out from under it ever since. And expanding it to include new containers would probably generate more opposition than we could overcome. Because the voters approved the law in the first place, it takes 3/4 vote of both houses of the legislature to change it. So that means you have to get 3/4 of each house to support the expansion. So what can we do? I would ask you, what can we do as alternatives to facilitate more recycling? Go ahead and answer the question. You're the expert, I'm not.
Jeez. There is always talk about making recycling more economical as well as more accessible. I still think that part of it is also reduction and reuse. We need to start thinking about how much we generate in terms of waste, because recycling can't 100% solve the problem. There is also a trade-off. Recycling, you are basically generating a raw product. That's the idea. And if there's not a demand for that raw material, then there's not a need to pick it up separately and incur the cost of separating it at the curbside. Also, there's costs associated with moving that raw material from where it's collected to the marketplace, and that can be a significant problem as well. When I worked in the area of recycling, professionally, there were grants to help create markets. Creating markets, it's not something government does really well to sort of incentivize changes in practices of private businesses. The best way to, I think, incentivize that is as consumers and making choices about consumers in terms of what we will purchase and in terms of recycling. For Mason County, we actually, for Ludington and Scottville, for where you have curbside collection of solid waste, you've got pretty decent recycling for such a rural county. The challenge is still where so many, in rural Michigan, so many areas don't even have curbside collection of solid waste. The idea that you'll have curbside collection of recyclables is difficult. But we need to continue to make those demands of our local government for those services. But also, recycling isn't the panacea. The amount of crap that gets put in recycling bins is really, really high. It's amazing that people still, we try all the time to educate people, and I'll tell people, you know, the rule is if you aren't sure, put it in the trash. Oh, I'll just put it in the recycling. You are basically making recycling inefficient when you put the wrong thing in a recycling bin. Putting the right thing. So we always say, every time, if you're not sure, put it in the trash, because you're creating a cost for that recycling program, and it's difficult to sustain it. But you have to think about what you're buying, and think about when you are recycling that you're doing it well. So just putting it in the bin isn't really always a good thing.
When in doubt, throw it out.
Yeah, when in doubt, throw it out. And it's really true. People still think somehow, oh, they'll figure it out when they get to the recycling facility. But there's a cost associated with getting that out. You can contaminate an entire batch of recyclables with one bad thing. So it's something that I know a few has been very involved in, and we try to educate people, but it's harder and harder. I rented a place in St. Petersburg, Florida over the summer, over the winter, and the recycling bins, they're curbside bins, but they were out in the alley. So even though they were assigned to a household, they were kind of community property. And I couldn't believe the amount of non-recyclables I found in those bins. I think someone to go from door to door going, what are you doing? You're basically making everything that went into that container unrecyclable because, you decided to put banana peels in there.
That's what you gotta do next winter when you go there, is to go door.
Yeah, I was just thinking, I was just gonna go door to door saying, excuse me, what are you thinking?
Recycling, please.
Yes, the recycling.
I have a question. Can I throw my used pizza box in the recycling or no?
Food contaminated cardboard should never go in there. Sometimes if you can rip the top off, sometimes the top can go in. But yeah, the number of pizza boxes in the curbside bins in St. Petersburg was really high.
Yeah.
And also people who don't break down their cardboard boxes. I was just really, it was like, I'm only here for a month, but I'm going to educate all of you folks.
So, right, Sharon.
Anyway. Wally.
One more quick question.
Yeah.
Could the citizens of Michigan do another initiative to amend the Constitution to take water bottles back?
Yes.
It would have to start there.
It'd take 500,000 signatures or something. I don't know the exact number, but the first law in '76 was put there by the voters through a signature, a ballot initiative. I should mention that Governor Milligan was the first signature on one of those petitions. So I've written his biography. He was definitely the governor that had the most interest and accomplishments in the environment. We're Republican. A lot of Republicans. So
Do those
anyway,
exist anymore?
I don't know. I don't know any, but there must be some out there.
And because I work for government, so I'm always looking at all sides of the issues. One of the tough issues with water bottles is social justice, is the fact that you have a lot of low-income households who their water supply is not all that good, and bottled water is basically what they live on. When the bottle bill was passed, it was easy to point out that those were considered luxury beverages, pop and beer. It's like, if you don't like the bottle, if you don't like to pay a deposit, don't drink soda and beer. But when you're talking about bottled water, you're talking about what some people need to survive. So it's a toughie in terms of the impact on low-income communities. Something I hadn't thought about until I was in a group where they were talking about it. There were folks from the Detroit environmental groups who were like, hey, wait. Think of Flint.
Yeah.
All right.
Well, thank you so much, Dave, for coming down.
Yeah, thanks for inviting me. Appreciate
Yeah,
it.
it's great.
You guys are doing great work here.
Yeah, we're trying, you know, it takes a lot of us. And Sharon, Edgar, for putting this together.